The sun hung low over the war-torn streets of Vietnam, casting long shadows over the rubble-strewn roads. Captain James Peterson, a young American soldier with piercing blue eyes and a hardened expression, found himself standing at the edge of a small village, his hands gripping his rifle as he watched the locals move about with caution. The sounds of helicopters in the distance, the constant hum of the war, seemed like an oppressive weight on his chest. The U.S. military had been stationed here for months, and though James had seen his fair share of violence, there was something about this place, its people, that stirred something deeper in him, something unspoken. And then he saw her. Lynn. She was sitting near a dilapidated hut, her long black hair braided tightly against the nape of her neck, her eyes scanning the horizon as though waiting for something. Her face was delicate but hardened by years of survival. She wore a simple dress, her skin a warm, rich shade that contrasted sharply with the pale uniformed soldiers who roamed through her village. She caught his eye for just a moment before quickly looking away, as though instinctively knowing that her gaze would be met with distrust, perhaps even hostility. James couldn't look away, even as his fellow soldiers chuckled and whispered, unaware of the turmoil that was slowly rising within him. Lynn was different, a reminder of something he couldn't fully comprehend, and the pull between them was undeniable. Weeks passed before their paths crossed again, this time in the heart of the village. James had been assigned a humanitarian mission, delivering aid to the locals, though he knew it was more of a front for something deeper, a way to try and win the hearts and minds of the people. He saw her again, standing by the river, filling water jugs, her expression solemn as the villagers worked around her. James approached cautiously, his boots sinking into the wet earth with each step. She turned at the sound of his approach, her eyes wary but not filled with fear, something different, a kind of quiet recognition. "You're American," she said, her voice calm but tinged with something James couldn't quite place. "I am," he replied, his own voice low, as if unsure of what to say next. She didn't respond immediately, merely studying him as though trying to decide whether he was friend or foe. The silence between them stretched, thick with the weight of history, of the war that had brought them to this point. "What do you want?" Lynn asked, her gaze hardening as she looked him over. James swallowed, feeling the sharpness of her words, the defensiveness in her tone. He didn't blame her. His uniform marked him as an invader, someone who had come to a foreign land, bringing with him destruction and death. But there was something about her, something that made him want to bridge the gap between them. "I want to help," he said, his words coming out before he could think twice. She raised an eyebrow, as if the idea of an American soldier offering help was absurd. "Help?" she asked skeptically, her lips curling into a bitter smile. "What do you know about help?" James hesitated, unsure of how to explain. "I know what it's like to feel trapped, to be caught between worlds that don't understand you," he said, his voice low. "I know that there are things that don't change just because you wear a uniform or carry a gun." Her eyes softened, just for a moment, before she turned her back to him, returning to the task at hand. "Then maybe you know that it's not that easy," she said quietly. "Maybe you know that you can't fix everything." She didn't look at him, but her words settled into his chest like a weight. He stayed there, watching her in silence, unsure of what to do next. Over the next few days, James returned to the village regularly. Every time, he would catch glimpses of Lynn, and though she always kept her distance, there was an undeniable tension between them, a silent understanding. He saw her in the markets, buying food for her family. He saw her at the well, her hands cupping the water as she drank, looking up at the stars with an expression of quiet longing. He had no illusions that their connection was anything more than fleeting, a moment in the midst of a violent war, but each time he saw her, it was like a spark igniting within him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, James couldn't hold back any longer. He found her at the edge of the village, sitting by a small fire, her face illuminated by the orange glow of the flames. He sat down beside her without asking permission, his heart racing. I don't know what I'm doing here, he said, his voice raw. Lynn glanced at him, her expression unreadable. Neither do I, she replied. For a long time, they sat in silence, the sound of the wind rustling the trees, and the occasional distant gunfire in the background. James couldn't help but wonder if this was all they would ever have, this brief, stolen moment before everything inevitably fell apart. You should go back to your people, Lynn said after a while, her voice quiet. Go back before you get hurt. Before they hurt you. James shook his head, his thoughts racing. I can't, he said, his voice filled with uncertainty. I can't go back to the way things were. Lynn turned to face him then, her eyes searching his, as though looking for something deeper. You can't stay here either, she said softly. You don't belong here. And I don't belong with you. James didn't know how to respond. The truth was, he felt torn between the two worlds, caught between his duty as a soldier and the pull of something far more powerful, something he couldn't explain, but something that had only grown stronger the more he saw Lynn. What do you want me to do? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lynn didn't answer immediately, her eyes distant as though contemplating something far beyond him. I don't know, she said finally. But I know this. There's no future for us here. Not like this. Not in the world we live in. Her words hit him harder than any bullet could. The weight of reality crashed down on him. He understood. The war, the racism, the cultural divide, there was no place for them in a world that wouldn't accept their love. But still, he couldn't shake the feeling that their connection, however brief, had changed something within him. And maybe, just maybe, it had changed something within her too. The next day, the news came. The military was moving out, and James was to return to his unit. He went to find Lynn one last time, but when he reached the spot where they had sat the night before, she was gone. He searched for hours, but there was no sign of her. It was as though she had vanished into the night, leaving behind only the memory of her touch, the fleeting connection that would haunt him for the rest of his life. James returned to his unit, the weight of what could have been settling heavily on his shoulders. He knew that he would never forget Lynn, her quiet strength, her defiance, her beauty. And as he boarded the plane to return home, he wondered if she had felt the same way, or if she had simply moved on, leaving him behind in the wake of a love that could never be. The story ended there, the future uncertain. What had begun as an impossible love in the middle of a war had become a lingering question, one that would never be answered. The cost of their love, of their connection, had been too high, and yet, in the silence of their parting, it felt like the beginning of something more than just a fleeting moment. It felt like a quiet rebellion against the forces that tried to tear them apart, even if it could never be fully realized. And as the plane soared into the sky, James couldn't help but think of her, of Lynn, and wonder what would have happened if the world had been different, if love had been enough to overcome the barriers they had faced. But he would never know. And that, perhaps, was the greatest tragedy of all. James sat quietly in the sterile seat of the plane, the hum of the engine filling the silence as the aircraft ascended into the sky, carrying him away from the land that had stolen his heart and soul. His eyes were fixed on the small window, but all he could see was the fading image of the village, its dust-choked roads, its crumbling huts, and the faces of the people who had lived through it all, their resilience etched in every wrinkle, every scar. And then there was Lynn. Her face, her eyes, the touch of her hand in his, it was all burned into his memory, a vivid, haunting image that he couldn't erase. He wondered if she was thinking of him too, or if she had already moved on, like she had said she would. The thought of her fading from his mind, of her becoming nothing more than a fleeting memory, filled him with a deep, gnawing emptiness. He had no illusions about what had happened between them. He knew it wasn't love in the traditional sense, not the kind of love people wrote about in books or sang about in songs. But it was something more, something raw and real. It was a connection forged in the flames of war, a bond that had defied the boundaries of race, culture, and history. He had never expected it to last, not in a world so divided, so bitterly torn by the hatred and prejudice of those in power. But for those few days, those stolen moments between missions and firefights, it had felt like something that could transcend the walls that separated them. He had shared something with Lynn that he had never shared with anyone else. She had seen him for what he was, not just a soldier, not just an instrument of war, but a man who had dreams, fears, and hopes just like her. It was the one thing that had given him courage in the face of everything the war had thrown at him. It was the one thing that had kept him going when the horrors of the battlefield seemed to swallow him whole. Now, as the plane cut through the clouds, James felt as though he were leaving more behind than just a village and a woman. He was leaving behind a piece of himself, a piece of his humanity that had been awakened by Lynn's touch, her words, her quiet strength. The war had stolen so much from him, but it had also given him something precious, something that he couldn't let go of. As the hours passed, and the plane continued its journey, James found himself lost in thought. He thought about Lynn's words, the last one she had spoken to him. "There's no future for us, not like this." She had been right, of course. They were from two different worlds, two different realities that could never coexist. He was a soldier, an instrument of a foreign power, and she was a woman caught in the heart of a conflict that had ravaged her land for years. What could they have built together? What could they have possibly hoped for when the world was so determined to tear them apart? And yet, despite the impossibility of their love, James couldn't help but feel that they had shared something worth remembering, worth holding on to. He would carry it with him for the rest of his life, a secret that only he and Lynn knew, a story that would never be told, a love that would never be realized. The plane descended as they neared the American airbase, and the familiar sight of the military complex came into view. James felt a lump rise in his throat as the reality of what was waiting for him settled in. He would return to his life as it had been before, duties, orders, a world that didn't understand him, a world that had no place for the man who had sat by a river with a Vietnamese woman, sharing a quiet moment of connection in the midst of chaos. As the plane touched down and the wheels screeched against the tarmac, James felt the weight of the world settle on his shoulders once again. The war was over for him, but it wasn't over for the people he had left behind. And as he stepped off the plane, into the harsh, sterile light of the American airbase, he couldn't shake the feeling that a part of him had been left behind too, that a part of him would always remain with Lynn, in that village by the river, where the war had tried to tear them apart but had only brought them closer together. In the weeks that followed, James threw himself into his duties, trying to suppress the memories of the time he had spent in Vietnam. He buried himself in paperwork, in debriefings, in the routines of military life, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the feeling that something was missing, something he couldn't quite put into words. He would catch himself staring out the window of his barracks, watching the planes take off and land, and for a brief moment, he would imagine what it would be like to return to Vietnam, to find Lynn again, to pick up where they had left off. But he knew that was impossible. He knew that if he went back, he would only be reminded of everything he couldn't have, everything that had been torn from him. Then, one day, a letter arrived. It was addressed to him, but the handwriting was unfamiliar. He opened it slowly, his heart pounding as he read the words written in neat, delicate script. Asterisk to Captain James Peterson, I hope this letter finds you well. I know this may seem strange, but I must write to you, for I cannot forget the days we spent together in the village. There are things that I never had the courage to say before, but now I find myself compelled to speak the truth. I have no hope that you will come back for me, but I want you to know that my feelings for you are real, and though the world tried to keep us apart, I will never forget you. I will never forget the brief moments of peace we shared, the warmth of your hand in mine. I will carry them with me for the rest of my life. And I hope you, too, can carry them with you, even as the world continues to tear us apart. With all my heart, Lynn. Asterisk, the letter slipped from his fingers as he read the last words, and for the first time since leaving Vietnam, James felt something deep within him break. It wasn't sadness or regret, but something far more profound. It was as though the weight of their love, Their connection had finally caught up with him. He realized that he would never be able to move on from Lynn, that no matter how far away he went, she would always be a part of him, a part of his soul that would never let go. James sat there, staring at the letter, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. He had never known what had happened to Lynn after he left, never known if she had found peace, if she had moved on. But now, in the quiet of his barracks, in the stillness of the night, he understood. Their love had been impossible, but it had been real. And as long as he lived, he would carry it with him, a secret buried deep within his heart, a love that could never be forgotten, no matter the distance, no matter the time. The story didn't end with the letter. It didn't end with the war or with the distance between them. It continued in the quiet moments of reflection, in the memories that refused to fade, in the unanswered question of what could have been. And perhaps that was the greatest love story of all, not the one written in history, but the one written in the hearts of two people who had dared to love despite the world telling them they couldn't. James sat frozen, the letter trembling in his hands, the weight of Lynn's words pressing down on him like the unbearable humidity of the Vietnamese jungle. His pulse pounded in his ears as he read her words again and again, as if memorizing them would somehow bring her closer, as if tracing her delicate handwriting with his fingertips could bridge the thousands of miles between them. The barracks were silent, save for the occasional distant roar of planes taking off from the airstrip, but inside his mind there was a storm. He had spent every waking moment since leaving Vietnam trying to suppress the memories, forcing himself to accept that whatever he and Lynn had shared had been fleeting, ephemeral, doomed from the start. And yet, here was proof that it had been real, that it had mattered, not just to him, but to her. He wanted to believe that, needed to believe it. But what was he supposed to do now? Go back? That was impossible. The war wasn't over for Vietnam, and even if it were, what would he do? Walk through the streets of Saigon, calling her name like a fool, hoping to catch a glimpse of her among the millions. He had no address, no way of knowing where she was, whether she was safe, whether she had moved on or married or disappeared into the chaos of a country still at war with itself. But the thought of never seeing her again was worse than any battlefield horror he had ever endured. The memories were relentless now, playing in his mind like an old reel of film, her laughter, quiet and restrained, as if she were afraid of being too happy in a world that had stolen so much from her, the way she had held his hand by the river, fingers interlaced as if anchoring herself to him, the night they had spent together in the dim glow of an oil lamp, when words had failed and all they had was touch, breath, and the fragile illusion of safety. He thought about the way she had pulled away from him the morning after, her gaze distant, already preparing for goodbye. Maybe she had known, even then, that this would be their fate. Maybe she had accepted it long before he had. The frustration boiled inside him, a helpless, burning anger at the world, at himself, at the invisible forces that dictated who could love whom, at the war that had taken everything from them before they had even had a chance to claim it as their own. He clenched his jaw, rubbing his face with his hands, trying to ground himself, but the emotions were too strong. He had to do something, anything, because the idea of sitting here, drowning in regret, was unbearable. He needed a plan. He needed answers. The next morning, he pulled every string he had, contacting old army buddies, intelligence officers, anyone who might still have contacts in Vietnam. He was relentless, spending weeks chasing down leads, poring over reports, desperately trying to find a trace of her. Most people dismissed him, told him to move on, warned him that even if he found her, it wouldn't change anything. But he couldn't let go. And then, after months of searching, after he had nearly given up hope, a name surfaced. Lynn Tran. A refugee. Smuggled out of Vietnam on a fishing boat, last seen in a refugee camp in the Philippines. The news hit him like a fist to the gut, relief, fear, hope, all tangled together. She was alive. But for how long? The camps were overcrowded, disease-ridden, and many never made it out. If he waited too long, if he hesitated, she could disappear again, this time forever. The decision was made before he even had time to think. Within days, he had pulled together the paperwork, fabricated a reason for a visit, and boarded a plane. The flight was long, giving him too much time to think, to doubt, to wonder if he was chasing a ghost. And yet, when he stepped off the plane onto the humid tarmac of Manila, his heart pounded with a certainty he had never felt before. He had come this far. He wouldn't turn back now. The refugee camp was a sea of makeshift tents, filled with the lost, the displaced, the survivors of a war that had shattered lives beyond recognition. He moved through the rows of people, scanning every face, his stomach twisting with nerves. And then, just when he was starting to think he had been too late, he saw her. She was thinner, her hair shorter, her clothes worn and faded, but it was her. Lynn. She turned, and for a moment, their eyes met across the crowded camp. Recognition flickered in her gaze, disbelief, and then something deeper, something that made his breath catch in his throat. He took a step forward, and so did she. Then another. And another. And suddenly, they were in front of each other, close enough to touch, yet paralyzed by the enormity of the moment. He wanted to say something, to tell her everything he had been holding inside since the day he left. But before he could, she reached for him, her fingers trembling, and when he pulled her into his arms, she clung to him as if letting go would mean losing everything. They stood there, in the middle of the chaos, in the ruins of what had been, and for the first time in a long time James felt whole. He didn't know what came next. He didn't know if they had a future, if the world would ever make space for them. But for now, in this moment, none of that mattered. Because against all odds, he had found her again. And that was enough. James held Lynn tightly, his arms wrapped around her as if afraid she might disappear again, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, questions, fears. She was real, she was here, but what had she been through? What had it taken for her to survive? His voice caught in his throat as he finally whispered her name, and she pulled back just enough to look at him, her dark eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place, relief, exhaustion, maybe even fear. He wanted to say everything at once, to tell her he had never stopped thinking about her, that he had searched for her in every shadow, every sleepless night, that he had crossed an ocean just to find her. But all that came out was a choked, "Lynn, She pressed a trembling hand against his face, as if making sure he was real, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The crowded refugee camp around them faded into the background, the voices of the lost and displaced merging into a dull hum. "I thought you were dead," she whispered finally, her voice barely audible over the distant rustling of tents, the cries of children, the murmurs of 1,000 weary souls. James shook his head, covering her hand with his own. "I thought I'd never see you again." Her breath hitched, her shoulders shaking, and before he could say anything else, she collapsed against him, her body racked with silent sobs. He held her as tightly as he could, feeling the weight of everything that had been lost, everything that had been taken from them. He didn't know how long they stood there, lost in their own world of grief and longing, but eventually Lynn pulled away, wiping at her face with the back of her hand. "We can't stay here," she said quickly, glancing around as if suddenly remembering where they were. Her posture shifted, becoming tense, guarded. "It's not safe." James frowned, alarmed by the urgency in her voice. "What do you mean? What's going on?" She didn't answer immediately, instead grabbing his hand and pulling him through the maze of tents, weaving between families huddled together on scraps of cloth, children playing barefoot in the dirt, men staring blankly at the horizon as if waiting for a future that might never come. "Lynn," he pressed, gripping her hand tighter. "Talk to me." She hesitated for a moment, then sighed, glancing over her shoulder. "I shouldn't be here," she admitted in a hushed voice. "I escaped." His blood ran cold. "Escaped from what?" She hesitated, then finally whispered, "A re-education camp." His stomach twisted. He had heard about the camps, the brutal places where so-called traitors were sent to be broken, reshaped, erased. The North Vietnamese government had promised unity after the fall of Saigon, but in reality, thousands of people, former South Vietnamese soldiers, intellectuals, anyone suspected of sympathizing with the Americans, had been imprisoned, starved, tortured. That Lin had been one of them, that she had survived, he could barely process it. "Jesus," he breathed, his grip on her tightening. "How did you get out?" She swallowed hard, her gaze darting to the side, as if afraid of being overheard. "I bribed a guard. My family had some gold left, hidden away. I used it to get onto a boat. It was—" she trailed off, shaking her head. "Not everyone made it." The unspoken horrors of that journey lingered in the air between them. James didn't push. He could see the pain in her eyes, the weight of memories too heavy to put into words. "And now?" he asked softly. "What happens now?" Lin took a deep breath, then squared her shoulders, her expression hardening. "I need to get out of here. The officials, they come sometimes, looking for people like me. If they find out who I am, they'll send me back. I can't go back, James." He didn't hesitate. "Then we'll get you out." Her eyes widened slightly. "We?" He nodded firmly. "I didn't come all this way to lose you again." A flicker of something passed through her expression, hope, fear, disbelief, but she didn't argue. Instead, she exhaled slowly and nodded. "There's a man," she said, "an American aid worker. He helps people get visas, sponsorships. I don't know if he'll help me, but—" James set his jaw. "Then let's find out." What followed was a blur of whispered conversations, clandestine meetings in the dimly lit corners of the camp, hushed negotiations with the aid worker, a wiry, middle-aged man named Carter, whose eyes were sharp with experience but softened with sympathy. He listened as Lin explained her situation, then turned to James with a calculating look. "You're military, aren't you?" James nodded. "Former. I have connections back home." Carter exhaled through his nose, drumming his fingers against the splintered wood of the table. "That might help, but it won't be easy. Getting her out legally could take months, maybe years." James felt Lin tense beside him, but Carter continued. "There is another way." James didn't like the way he said it. "What kind of way?" Carter leaned in, lowering his voice. "A smuggler. I know a guy. It's risky. She'd have to travel through Malaysia, maybe farther. But it's faster." James clenched his fists. The thought of Lin being packed onto another boat, risking her life again, it was unbearable. But so was the alternative. "No," he said finally. "I'll find another way." Carter studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "If you want another way, you'd better work fast." Over the next few days, James pulled every favor he had, contacting embassies, pleading with old contacts in the military. Time was running out. The longer Lin stayed in the camp, the greater the chance that someone would recognize her, that she'd be sent back to the nightmare she had escaped. And then, just when it seemed hopeless, a miracle. A friend of a friend, a senator's aide, pulled strings, fast-tracking a humanitarian visa. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. 2 weeks later, James stood beside Lin at the airport, holding her hand as they walked toward the gate. She clutched her papers like they were her lifeline, her fingers trembling. "I can't believe this is real," she whispered. "It is," he said firmly. "You're safe now." But even as he said it, doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. Was she? Would she ever be? America had its own ghosts, its own prejudices. Their fight wasn't over, it was only just beginning. And yet, as the plane took off, as Lin rested her head against his shoulder, James allowed himself to believe that, for the first time in a long time, they had a chance. What came next? They would face it together. James sat in the dimly lit apartment, staring at the immigration papers on the table, his fingers tracing the embossed seal as if trying to convince himself that this was real, that after everything, after war and separation, after the years of fear and uncertainty, Lin was finally here, finally safe, or as safe as they could be. He turned his head slightly, watching her as she slept on the worn-out couch, her breathing steady but shallow, exhaustion carved into her face like a permanent shadow. He knew she wasn't sleeping well, that nightmares still clawed at her in the dark, that sometimes she woke up trembling, whispering in a language he couldn't understand, but a pain he could feel all the same. He wished he could take it away, wished he could erase the years she had spent running, hiding, surviving, but time didn't work that way, and neither did trauma. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face, his mind racing with thoughts of what came next. America wasn't the promised land they made it out to be, not for people like Lynn, not for people like him. Even now, neighbors watched them with suspicion, whispers followed them when they walked down the street together, some people outright sneering at the sight of a white man with an Asian woman, and it infuriated him in ways he couldn't put into words. He had fought in a war that had taken everything from him, had lost men who bled and died in jungles that weren't theirs, had seen the worst of humanity in the name of democracy, and now, even here, in his own country, he had to fight a different kind of war, one he wasn't sure he knew how to win. But he wouldn't leave her. Not now. Not ever. Lynn stirred in her sleep, a soft sound escaping her lips, and he was at her side in an instant, crouching down, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and glassy with unshed tears, and for a moment, she just looked at him, as if grounding herself in the present, as if making sure he was still there. "Bad dream?" he asked softly, and she nodded, swallowing hard. "I was back there," she whispered. "In the camp." His jaw tightened, rage and helplessness twisting inside him. "You're not there," he murmured, taking her hand, pressing it against his chest so she could feel the steady beat of his heart. "You're here. With me." She closed her eyes, nodding again, but he could see the ghost still clinging to her, refusing to let go. He didn't know how to fight them. He didn't know if he ever could. But he would try. Every day, for as long as it took. The next morning, the sun barely rising over the city skyline, they walked together down the quiet streets, Lynn clutching his arm, as if afraid the world might swallow her whole. They were heading to the immigration office, one final meeting before her status was fully secured, before she could start looking for work, before they could truly begin building a life. But as they turned the corner, a voice rang out from behind them, sharp, familiar, and ice crawled down James's spine. "Lynn!" She froze, her fingers tightening on his arm, and slowly, hesitantly she turned. James followed her gaze, his stomach sinking when he saw the man standing there. He was older now, thinner, but his face was the same, his presence suffocating. A former officer, one of the men who had tormented prisoners in the re-education camp, a man Lynn had once feared more than death itself. "No," she breathed, stepping back, shaking her head. "No, it can't be." But it was. And he was smiling. "I thought you were dead," the man said, tilting his head. "I see I was wrong." James moved without thinking, stepping in front of Lynn, shielding her with his body. "Who the hell are you?" The man ignored him, his eyes locked on Lynn, something cold and amused lurking behind them. "You should have stayed gone," he said. "You don't belong here." Lynn trembled, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps, and James could feel her fear like a living thing pressing against his skin. "You need to walk away," James said, his voice low, dangerous. The man chuckled. "Or what?" And then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the morning haze, but his presence lingered like a stain, like the promise of something unfinished. Lynn's grip on James's arm was bruising, her nails digging into his skin. He turned to her, cupping her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. "He's not going to hurt you," he promised, but she didn't look convinced. Neither was he. That night, James sat by the window, a cigarette burning between his fingers, his mind replaying the encounter over and over, his instincts screaming that this wasn't over. Lynn sat across the room, staring at nothing, lost in thoughts he couldn't reach. He wanted to tell her it would be okay, that they had made it this far, that they could survive anything, but he wasn't sure if he believed it. The past had a way of catching up, and he was afraid that this time, it would. The following days blurred into one another, heavy with tension. The city around them continued its hum, indifferent to the chaos that was unraveling in their lives. Lynn became a shadow of herself, withdrawn, quiet, her eyes no longer filled with the hopeful spark they once had. James couldn't reach her, and it gnawed at him in ways he couldn't express. She barely spoke, only nodding or shaking her head in response to his attempts to comfort her, and when she did speak, her voice was brittle, as though any word would crack her. That encounter with the man from her past had shattered something inside her, something fragile that James didn't know how to fix. He kept his distance, respecting her space, but never stopping his quiet attempts to show her that she was safe, that she was no longer that frightened girl in the camp, that he would never let anything happen to her. The old officer's face haunted him in the nights, his mocking smile searing into James's mind. He had seen men like him before, men who would stop at nothing to break what they couldn't control, and he knew that Lynn was far from free of them. He was terrified that the past, the horror she had fled, would follow them to the life they were trying to build. One evening, after several days of silence, Lynn broke the stillness, her voice shaking as she said the words James had feared. "He knows where I am. He knows everything." James's heart froze in his chest. "What are you talking about?" She shook her head, the anguish clear in her face. "He's not just some man. He's someone who has connections. He can find us. He won't stop." Her words struck him like a blow. She was right. They couldn't outrun the ghosts of the past, no matter how far they tried to go. The scars she carried, the terror that still gripped her when she slept, it was all tied to this man, to her history, and now he had returned. There was no escaping it. But James refused to let that truth dominate them. He stood, pacing in the small apartment, his thoughts churning. There had to be a way to protect her. He had to do something, anything. "We leave," he said, his voice hard with resolve. "We get out of here. We go somewhere safe." Lynn's eyes widened, and she looked at him as though he had just suggested something impossible. "Where will we go?" she whispered. "Where will I be safe?" James didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing. He couldn't lose her. He wouldn't let fear rule their lives. The days that followed were filled with a frantic kind of preparation. James made arrangements to leave, to take her somewhere they could disappear. But every move felt heavy with doubt, as though every step forward was pushing them closer to the edge. There was a price to freedom, and James felt the weight of it. He couldn't just abandon the life he had built in this country, the friends he had made, the work he had done. He couldn't sever all the connections that had kept him grounded. But there was no choice. Lynn's safety, their chance to be free, it came first. He went to the old car he had bought just a few months before, the one that had given them the first taste of normalcy. He packed what little they had, and together they set out, not knowing what lay ahead, but knowing they could not stay. As they drove away from the city, the streetlights fading into the rearview mirror, Lynn sat silently beside him, her eyes distant. James glanced over at her, his heart heavy with the weight of their decision. "We'll get through this," he promised her again, but the words felt hollow in the face of everything they had lost, everything they were running from. They drove for hours, crossing state lines, the world outside a blur as the weight of their reality pressed on them. The world was vast, and they were small in it, but the future seemed fragile, and every mile brought them closer to a moment where they would either break or find something worth holding on to. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The next morning, just as they stopped at a small, dusty diner in the middle of nowhere, a car pulled up behind them. James's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the vehicle. The officer from the camp, the one who had haunted them both, stepped out, his eyes locking onto James. Lynn's breath caught, and James could see the panic in her eyes, her body trembling with fear. The officer's smile was the same, that cruel, twisted grin that promised nothing but suffering. "You can't run forever," he said coldly. Lynn tried to step back, to flee, but James stood firm, his hand reaching out to stop her. "Leave us alone," James said, his voice steady, but the fear inside him threatened to break through. The officer laughed, the sound cutting through the stillness of the morning like a knife. "You think you can escape the past? You think running will save her?" He turned to Lynn, his eyes narrowing. "She'll never be free of me. You're wasting your time." The officer took a step forward, but James was already moving, his fist connecting with the man's jaw with a force he didn't know he had in him. The officer staggered back, but he didn't fall. James didn't wait for him to recover. He pulled Lynn toward the car, urging her to get in. But before they could drive off, the officer shouted, "You think you're saving her? You're not. She'll always be mine." Those words lingered in the air long after they had left. James didn't know if he could ever fully protect her from the past, from the horror she had lived, but in that moment, as they drove away from the diner, away from the man who had tormented her, he vowed to keep running. No matter where they went, no matter what they had to endure, he would fight for her. He would keep her safe. And he would love her, no matter the cost. As they disappeared into the horizon, the future seemed uncertain, but one thing was clear. They were together, and as long as they had each other, they had a chance. The road ahead was long, but it was theirs to walk. If you found this story moving and want to see more gripping, emotional tales, don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on the latest content. Your support means the world, and it helps us bring more stories to life. Thank you for being part of this journey.